Madam Chair, Dr. Michelle Scobie, our special guest, His Excellency Ambassador Serge Lavroff, ambassadors and members of the diplomatic corps, government officials, members of the U.W.I community, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jessica Byron, and I'm the director of the Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. Despite the inclement weather, which is perhaps fitting given the title of today's diplomatic dialogue. And it comes at a particularly opportune time because I think that here in Trinidad and Tobago, over the last 2 weeks, we've had, well, a little longer, over the last couple of months, we have had very significant and poignant reminders of our vulnerability to climatic changes and also to natural events, to natural disasters, and the fact that we need to take them much more into consideration in our everyday behavior, in our planning, and in our preparations as we go about our daily lives. So I'm extremely happy to welcome Ambassador Lavroff today as he gives us an address focused on the Paris Agreement and global developments, global and regional developments designed to meet the threats and the risks of climate change. And I hope that we will have a very stimulating conversation thereafter. I'd like to, of course, extend my own personal empathy and the concern of the entire Institute to all the people who have been affected by the floods in Trinidad over the last 2 weeks. There has been a silver lining from those events. It has been very impressive to see the way in which most of the country, the entire country, responded with solidarity efforts to assist people who were badly affected and whose homes have been very badly damaged in the inclement weather that we've recently experienced. And so climate change and climate disaster brings out it exposes us to some of the worst events we could imagine, but it can also bring out the best in terms of our responses. There's always an element of choice. There's always the possibility for human agency in response to negative events. And I think that what we have seen in the last couple of weeks is a reminder that human agency and appropriate response is always within our reach. And hopefully today we'll be able to learn a bit more about the possibilities for such responses and about how we can position ourselves in the Caribbean and internationally to face up to climate change and to improve our climate resilience. So my job is really to welcome you and to hope that we have a very stimulating discussion and to thank the ambassador for coming here this afternoon. It's a very important discussion for us here at U.W.I, and I think it has a broader impact on the society. We have these diplomatic dialogues as part of the Institute and the Diplomatic Academy's outreach, part of our mission to inform Caribbean communities of events and situations that in the global arena that have particular significance for us, and to increase our collective levels of awareness to such events And so I'm very happy that you all came this afternoon, and I hope that you will keep on coming to our events, because we put these on a regular basis, and they are extremely meaningful. I just want to, before I leave the podium, give a plug for some upcoming events. I've been informed since I came in that tonight is the opening of the Green Screen Environmental Film Festival, which I think is hosted by and sponsored partly by the Canadian High Commission in Trinidad. And it starts tonight with a film on Kiribati in the Pacific and the climate threats that are faced by those Pacific territories. And it is showing at the IMAX Cinema in Port of Spain, 1 Woodbrook Place, at 6 o'clock, starting at 6 p.m. So if you can, please try to attend this evening's film and the others that will be showing. And I also want to let you know that on the 13th of November, we have a public lecture here by Professor Karin Arts from the Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University in the Netherlands. She will be here participating in the Caribbean Child Research Conference, but she's also going to be giving a public lecture on the impact on children of climate change and climate-related disasters. So that will be on the 13th of November at 1 o'clock, right here in this room. So you're very welcome. If you have the time, please come and listen to Professor Arts. Without any more ado, I hand you over to Ambassador Lavroff.
Merci, Madame la Directrice, dear friends of climate change and environment. Well, my name is Lavroff, but I assure you I am not the Russian foreign minister. More modestly, I'm the ambassador of France. Well, firstly, I would like to thank the University of West Indies and its International Relations Institute for the invitation to come to speak about a topic poised to assume major importance in the years to come and in the decades to come. Climate change, as we know, is the greatest threat to our future. The Secretary General of the United Nations said the same a few weeks ago in New York, while he raised global awareness of the absolute need to act if we want to leave a habitable planet for future generations. He announced the holding of a global climate summit in the margins of the next General Assembly in New York in 2019. The consequences of climate change have been widely studied on a scientific level. Today, we have enough precise data to measure its impact on the survival of our ecosystems, the stability of our climates, and on our everyday lives. What I would like to draw your attention to today is the effect that this change is going to have on our collectivities, the stability of our societies, and the relationships that different groups are led to foster. In short, climate change is becoming a new factor in the disturbance of international relations, and in doing so, introduces a new risk of conflict among peoples and between states. The Nobel Committee clearly understood this when it awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize to the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change. This group of renowned scientists who have been working for 30 years to make us aware the dangers which threaten our future. And this year, it is the Bank of Sweden who is awarding the Nobel Prize for Economy for the first time to two economists for their work on climate change. Last July, the United Nations Security Council considered the issue and, for the first time since 2007, held a meeting specially dedicated to the link between climate change and the risk of conflicts. That is certainly an uncommon subject on the agenda of such a forum, and it must be recognized that the UN is late in its reflection, which is necessary in this area. However, the facts are there, and no one can ignore them any longer. Forced displacement of local populations, loss of means of subsistence, heightened food risks, socio-economic marginalization, and weakening of public institutions are widely observed direct consequences of climate change, which act as multiplier of threats and conflicts. This is the case in areas of the planet most affected by drought, such as the Middle East or Africa, which were particularly impacted and where the disappearance of natural resources fuels local conflicts, which tend to become national and then regional. The depletion of available resources only increases the tensions and chases entire populations from their traditional habitats and areas of subsistence, giving rise to a new phenomenon which we now refer to in international organizations as climate migration. This is why a great majority of the UN member states have asked the Secretary General to establish an annual report which details the risks tied to climate change in conflict zones. France supported this initiative by putting forward the idea of a multilateral diplomacy which takes into account the effects of climate change in a conflict prevention approach. Having said this, in lieu of an introduction, I now propose to further outline, and in order to do so, to show how much climate change affects the living space and even the possibility of survival of entire populations. In the second part, the influence of this phenomenon on the stability and the security of the world. And finally, in the last part, the extent to which it seems necessary and urgent to prepare the international community to eradicate the resulting threats and put the necessary things in place. This is what we would refer to as climate diplomacy. Climate change is not, definitely not, a foregone conclusion. Fatalité in French. Foregone conclusion, this is the translation I got in English. It could become ground for cooperation, allowing for dialogue and an organized sharing of responsibilities at a global level. In other terms, a strengthening of the state of international law. I propose to begin by examining the consequences of climate change, which have already been observed in their most radical forms. I think there is no need to be an expert to realize that these affect millions of people around the world in such a manner that they no longer aim to adapt, but simply to survive. At the top of the list of most endangered zones, we find Africa. Half of the population there depends on agriculture for subsistence. Any change in temperature or rainfall on this continent, therefore, has a direct impact on daily life, access to water, and food. Desertification is progressing there on a disconcerting scale. The situation is particularly dramatic at Lake Chad, which is drying up day by day and around which the lives of millions of people have been organized for centuries. In this way, Lake Chad has seen its surface area go from 25,000 square kilometers to 2,500 square kilometers, a loss of 90%. Yet 30 million people live around the lake and have a definite need for its water for subsistence purposes, for agriculture, farming, or fishing. The situation there is today explosive for access to the scarce remaining water resources. In the Middle East, two large feeder rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, I don't know if I pronounce correctly, I should say it in Arabic, but I don't know, cradle of civilizations, thousands of years old, have already lost 50% of their volume of water in 20 years. In Iraq, 90% of the territory is under threat of desertification, with 15% of that country's cultivable space already lost. Its government was forced to outlaw the cultivation of rice and corn because of the constant water stress affecting the region. The issue of the scarcity of water resources is therefore generally a growing cause for concern. 1/3 of humanity now lives in a situation of water stress. Only 9 countries in the world share 60% of the planet's fresh water reserves. Asia, home to 60% of the world's population, only has 30% of the world's water available. Climate change only worsens these inequalities. In other places, it is the maritime weather, more and more instable and chaotic, which is the threat. In small island countries, especially in our Caribbean region, we are well poised to be aware of it, given the constant threat of tropical storms, coastal erosion, sargassum seaweed invasion, and loss of biodiversity. An island state such as Dominica was completely devastated last year, is the first example in the history of mankind of a country totally destroyed by a climate disaster. The equivalent of a nuclear explosion. In the Pacific, some island states like Nauru or Tuvalu, in the Indian Ocean, the Maldives, are simply under threat of disappearing underwater due to the sea level rise. There also, the risk of an entire country disappearing is no longer fiction. In South and Southwestern Asia, the situation is just as worrying because of a geography that is greatly vulnerable and very exposed to the hazards of climate and rising waters. 80% of the surface of the Red River Delta, the breadbasket of rice in Vietnam, is below the sea level. A country like Bangladesh, located in the Bay of Bengal, in the heart of the largest river delta in the world, and without any mountains, is today one of the countries which are most susceptible to massive flooding. On average, one major hurricane strikes this country every 3 years. Close to 3,000 hectares of cultivable land are swallowed there every year by the flooding of the rivers. 1/3 of the territory of this country of 160 million inhabitants is under threat of being swallowed up. Finally, I would like to mention an unexpected development of climate change, which is the melting of the ice in Arctic zones, which results in the gradual appearance of a new economic space for which the geopolitical consequences are considerable. The Arctic harbors almost 100 billion barrels of oil, 40 trillion cubic meters of gas, 10% of world hydrocarbon reserves, as well as substantial mineral wealth. I will leave you to guess the greed that this new situation could cause. once the area is free of ice, this new economic Eldorado will in effect be susceptible to exploitation for profit, perhaps an additional reason for disputes over territory and access to resources, but why not also future collaboration? It is certainly too early to make declarations on this, but in any case, Russia decided to anticipate and plant its flag on the Arctic region's seabed and reconfigure its northern Siberian coastline in order to turn this area into a new trade and communication area. The increasing scope of these climate phenomena and their impact on societies leads us to explore in this second part the balance and stability and ultimately the safety of entire areas of the planet. Because for inhabitants of these regions, the violence of nature's reactions and the resulting imbalance leave no choice. In the absence of access to resources, especially water, it is forced an inevitable migration which is required. For those who stay behind, the scarce remaining food resources then become a constant source of tension and conflicts. The FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, has just published an alarming report on this topic, highlighting the fact that the climate disruptions affect the capacity of populations to feed themselves, and that climate variability and instability are becoming one of the main causes of food insecurity in today's world. Sustainable Development Goal number 2, zero hunger, now seems unattainable by 2030. It is therefore important to note the continuously growing number of forced migrations of populations which generate different climate events and the degradation of the environment that this may cause. International organizations, notably the HCR, UNHCR, and the IOM, International Organization for Migrations, already call this type of population climate refugees. The World Bank, in a recent study, estimates to be 140 million the number of persons forced to migrate by 2050, solely for reasons linked to climate change. The UN raises this figure to at least 250 million persons, also by 2050. If nothing is done to stop climate change, these climate migrations could then affect between 15 and 20% of humanity and cause the worst global crisis of the 21st century. Also, it is estimated that between 2008 and 2014, natural disasters have caused the displacement of 185 million persons, or 26 million annually or average. The great majority of these displacements is linked to meteorological disruptions. Climate change has already resulted in twice the number of displaced persons globally than armed conflicts. During the same period, it is the poorest countries, the most vulnerable countries who have been most affected, 90% of the total. To date, we do not have absolute proof that certain conflicts are caused by climate disruptions, but we have good reasons to think that certain climate crises have very greatly contributed to the aggravation of already tense local situations and destabilization of delicate balances. In other terms, uncontrolled chain reactions resulting in armed conflicts. In this regard, I would like to give you a few examples. The first example is that of Sudan. In that country, which has experienced several waves of civil war, the rainfall is increasingly diminishing. Desertification has progressed 100 kilometers in 40 years into a once fertile area. Since its independence, this country has lost 40% of its forests. Access to resources has dwindled in dramatic fashion and exacerbated the competition for use of available land among the livestock breeding population and those who live of agriculture. Sudan is the first case of a war-torn country in which we are almost certain that climate change is a direct cause of violence. There is also the case of Lake Chad, which I just mentioned. The distress and poverty caused by the degradation of the environment and the means of subsistence of the local populations, while not directly responsible, have created favorable conditions for the birth and expansion of the Islamist movement, Boko Haram. Originating in northern eastern Nigeria, this organization, which is aligned with the Islamic State, has in few years won influence over an area spanning 4 African countries, parts of Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon, and continues to recruit persons from among the poorest populations in this region. Not long ago, Boko Haram perpetrated in June an attack in the very heart of the capital of Chad, N'Djamena, and violent battles took place around Lake Chad between this organization and the Chadian army. For several years, this region, one of the poorest in Africa, has been under constant tension. Another case is Syria. It turns out that this country experienced between 2006 and 2010, just before the civil war broke out, the worst drought in its history. This situation affected 60% of its territory, devastated the wheat belt in the northeast of the country, destroyed 85% of livestock, and forced 800,000 Syrian farmers deprived of resources to migrate to the towns, quickly generating unbearable social tensions. In 2010, 1 year before the conflict broke out, Syria already had 1.5 million displaced persons without resources. It was specifically in Dara, one of the towns destabilized by massive influx of climate refugees, that the first uprising occurred in 2011, a prelude to the ensuing events and war. Finally, one more troubling coincidence is provided to us between the sudden spike in food prices in North Africa and the advent of uprisings known as the Arab Spring. While Syria was the most obvious example, elsewhere in the Arab world, we have seen similar occurrences. The amplification of droughts, which have left their mark all over the planet, in China, Russia, Ukraine, has given rise to a sharp rise in grain prices on the global market. Aggravated by speculation, this phenomenon has caused an increase in bread prices in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, those countries in northern Africa which experienced severe disturbances in 2011, 2012, and given rise to a well-known phenomenon which we call the hunger riots. These few examples clearly show that climate change is also and will continue, climate imbalance is also and will continue to increasingly be a social, political, and geopolitical imbalance. You will not be surprised to learn that those first troubled by this evolution are the military, and most of all in the United States. Allow me in this regard to give few explanations. In 2003, the US Army invaded Iraq at a time when the George Bush administration was dominated by a wave of climate skepticism. The ensuing occupation generated a tremendous need to adapt to local extreme climate conditions, temperatures, and drought, pointlessly exposing them, the US Army, to attacks and causing a spiral of endless expenses in transportation convoys and air conditioning. In order to reduce the level of spending, which became unmanageable, the American Army discovered green technologies, making use notably of solar panels. It is in this particular context that the Pentagon leaked that year a confidential, so-called confidential report entitled An Abrupt Climate Change Scenario and Its Consequences for US National Security. This document was surprisingly visionary, since the United States discovered their own vulnerability to climate change 2 years later, in August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. The aftermath was terrible: 1,800 deaths, 1 million people displaced, $150 billion in damage. The entire city was covered by water in a situation of complete chaos. It is then that the US Army, already heavily deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, realized that it did not have the means to intervene and was forced to call on a private security firm, Blackwater, to enter the city, which was trapped underwater, to help the victims and, above all, to restore order. For the American Army, Katrina was a true collective shock, leading to the launch of truly deep reflection on the strategic significance of climate change and introspection on the way in which societies, states, and defense systems would eventually be placed under increasing pressure by the combined effects of climate change, water crisis, international competition for energy, natural resources and food, the collapse of biodiversity, and even new risks of pandemics. The French Army has not been left out and has also integrated in his military doctrine the climate dimension in the threats to be considered. In 2015, just before the big conference in Paris that was supposed to launch the Paris Agreement, an international conference entitled Climate and Defense was held, taking all these issues into account. The main conclusion was that climate change could be a triggering factor which exacerbates all the current threats to the world's security and stability. But the most important point in this conclusion, in my opinion, is the idea, and I would wish to conclude this second part on a positive note, that, I quote, "It is not so much the degradation of nature, but our own incapacity to find solutions and to work together, which matters most to overcome the challenge." Climate change is therefore not a foregone conclusion. It is instead the opportunity, by putting pressure on the entire international community, to find new ways of solidarity and cooperation. I would like to, in this last part, mention the way in which French diplomacy views the situation and some of the proposals and diplomatic initiatives which we have supported and initiated up to today. To summarize all what has been said, allow me to quote the President of the French Republic, Mr. Emmanuel Macron, who said, I quote, "We cannot eradicate the roots of war, fight effectively against terrorism, and ensure peace and stability if we do not take decisive action against climate change." The tragic example of Syria is there to remind us. Decisive action, what does that mean? In the 21st century, when everything teaches us to think global, to act global, to work global, it simply means that we have to go beyond the existing borders, beyond the limits of traditional diplomacy involving the states, and mobilize on a wider scale. Climate diplomacy, therefore, must be a 21st century diplomacy, mobilizing all stakeholders, the international community, the globalized economy, and global civil society, in order to make the fight against climate change a priority and the business of everyone. More than ever, we need to reach there from a strong multilateralism and associate there with three things: the political will of the states, the financial means and the technology of the private sector, and the continuous pressure of the civil society, and to make them converge towards a common goal. We did it successfully with the Paris Agreement, which is up to now the greatest diplomatic achievement of the 21st century. Century just started, so there will be more diplomatic achievements. And we'll go on to do it within the G7 presidency, which will be assumed by France next year, when we take over from Canada. Climate change will be definitely one of the key topics on the agenda. At political level, we think that it is essential to adopt a demanding environmental code of conduct which is legally binding for all. It is to this end that France proposed and supported a draft of Global Pact for Environment. It is in this spirit that Emmanuel Macron, President of the Republic, got personally involved in this project, which has quickly garnered growing international support. Last May 10, a procedural resolution was adopted at the General Assembly with an overwhelming vote in favor of this text. 145 for, 5 against, 6 abstentions. The result of a great collective effort. An intergovernmental working group was formed to identify the current international legal instrument. A pre-draft of this text has already been completed, prepared by a group of 100 legal experts from 40 countries. What is this global pact about? The idea is simply to bring together all the texts which currently exist on the protection of environment to this time, produce a single and a unique text which will be legally binding, thereby laying the foundation for a true international environment law. To date, there are only texts of general principles formulated at various international summits, such as the Rio Declaration in 1992 or the Stockholm Declaration in 1972. These texts have a great symbolic value, but so far none of them have been legally imposing. Once adopted, the procedural resolution, the working group then began to tackle the preparation of recommendations to the 2019 General Assembly with a view to, and we hope to get there, to definitely adopting the text in 2020. It is important to note that this text, once adopted, could be invoked in court and will be the first true global treaty on environment. The President of the Republic wishes to complete this legal component through an essential involvement of the private sector in favor of the energy transition and energies of the future. He launched and supports in this regard an important initiative, the One Planet Summit, whose first session was held in Paris last December, attended by more than 4,000 participants, including World Bank Chairman and the UN Secretary General, in order to mobilize the private sector, companies, and the international financial world for climate. 12 important commitments were made on this occasion, and I think you may have noticed that the commitment number 1 aims to, I quote, respond to extreme events in island states, and that the first priority action in this regard is to turn Caribbean into the first climate smart zone in the world. On this occasion, the Caribbean Climate Smart Coalition, bringing together 26 countries and 40 partners and aiming at making the Caribbean a low carbon and resilient zone, was established. This project is now a reality since its official launch last August in Kingston. Since then, a dynamic is on the move. We have noticed that the renewable energy production technologies continue to advance with prices which are regularly and continuously dropping. In 2017, the installed solar energy capacity in the world increased more quickly than that of any other technology, with $160 billion invested that year, an increase of 18% in comparison to the previous year. With time, it means more cheap energy for all, less competition for scarce and depleting resources, and as a consequence, less conflicts. This is in the same spirit that the President Macron is strongly supporting the ESA, the International Solar Alliance, which was set up by India and France during the COP21 in Paris in 2015. The success of this first edition of the One Planet Summit therefore encouraged President Macron to continue the exercise and hold a second session on September 26 in the margin of the General Assembly in New York. Several announcements and financial commitments were made at that event, coming from development banks, private investment funds, the European Union, and territorial collectivities. I wish to mention among these the announcement by BlackRock, a fund which is today the largest asset manager in the world, with a capital of $5 trillion in assets, of the upcoming creation of a new special investment fund dedicated to renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy investment storage, energy storage, sorry, and low carbon transportation. And I mentioned also the announcement made by Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, and 11th richest man in the world, and perhaps US presidential candidate in 2020, who committed to establishing on Wall Street a network exclusively dedicated to green funding for encouragement of sustainable financial innovation. Finally, it is important for climate diplomacy to be able to continue to be supported by the global civil society, which is mobilized more and more every day in favor of the climate. I could mention many examples of public gatherings on climate everywhere in the world, involving persons, scientists, medias, NGOs, and even religious leaders like the Pope from all over the world, which are reported in the media. I would consider, without a doubt, the most spectacular during these last few weeks, the Global Climate Action Summit, which was held in September in San Francisco at the initiative of the Governor of California, Jerry Brown, and brought together 4,000 participants representing cities, regions, private companies, and NGOs most committed to the fight against climate change. Well, it is on this encouraging, yes, encouraging, and positive and optimistic note that I would like to end this presentation with the conviction that this mobilization of the planet, which is happening, is just a first step. It is a sign that a new form of citizenship, I insist on that, a new form of citizenship and solidarity is emerging. The feeling of belonging to a single planet, of sharing a common responsibility, and respecting the earth to which we owe our lives. Global citizen is already being defined as the future new passport for us all. I thank you for your attention and your patience, and forgive me for my accent.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Scobie. I'm the chair for this afternoon. We'd like to thank Ambassador. Another round of applause for that very exciting, stimulating presentation. So climate change is not a foregone conclusion, but a way to find international commitment towards new ways of solidarity and cooperation. You know? And we cannot eradicate the roots of war, fight terror, peace and security, achieve peace and security if we do not eradicate climate change. And the example of the situation in Syria was a good reminder of that, says the French president, as quoted by our ambassador. Indeed, I'm sure that all of us have many personal example stories. We've read many things related to climate change. It's one of those things that affects every area of discipline as academics and practitioners, from biodiversity to loss and damage debates on climate financing to disaster risk reduction to, you name it, culture, music, the arts. And so I'm sure that it's something that all of us, we have some sort of direct interest in the issue of climate change. Of course, we have some time for questions, and as I was speaking with Ambassador before, he can't answer everything that can be asked on climate change because, of course, it's as wide as the earth itself. But I thought very interesting was his comment on the new global passport, and that has implications for diplomacy, for politics, for economics, for social sciences, a new global passport, a new form of citizenry and solidarity. And in a sense, it's something that we've experienced here in the region with the recent disasters that we've had. People who've experienced the disasters, we didn't ask them before we gave them a help package what country they were from, you know. We understood that we all together were citizens with a common destiny and a common path to forge. And maybe that's, you know, the Caribbean is always like a melting pot for the world. Maybe this is the beginning of a new way of looking at the global challenge of climate change, our own personal experience in the Caribbean. Enough from me. I would like to open the floor to questions. We can take probably 2 or 3, and then we'll give the ambassador some time to respond to those questions. Yes, so there's a mic that will be moving around the room for anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment. And please remember to begin by introducing yourself and then asking a question. Yes. Dr. Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the ambassador for giving us that lovely panoramic view of the state of the climate discussion. I want to take off from your last point about global citizenship, and which he mentioned at the end, and to ask whether we are not seeing the opposite trend, which is that we're seeing a reaction to globalization today, the rise of nationalism throughout Europe, in the United States, and so on. And my fear is that we're not going to get very far with this concept of world government and global citizenship. And that may not be so much be related to this question of climate change. It may have to do much more with this, the basic concept of the nation as we understand it, and a question of national identity as we know it. And that's my first concern. My second concern is really the question of the pace at which we are going. From all the initiatives he has announced, and I think they're certainly admirable, the idea of getting a legal compact and so forth, does he think we are moving fast enough to avoid the catastrophe down the road? Because we're seeing reversals. We are not moving in a nice linear straight line forward. We're seeing, for instance, the reversal, for instance, in the United States with the American administration, at least at the federal level. So I am somewhat skeptical because people have been, and specialists in the field have been suggesting that we're moving too slow. We are not going to be able to stop the sea from rising. I don't know, but you would know more about that than me. But these are my 2 questions that I would like some response to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. We'll take one more question. Is that okay? Okay, sure, Ambassador. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. I can try to answer to your 2 questions. Concerning the passport, well, do not take for face value what I say. It's a dream. It's what in French we say au sens figuré. My idea is that, and many people in France, in Europe, in the world, has the same idea, that we are all equal before disasters and climate change. We are only humans, and nature, when it explodes, has such a violence, we cannot do anything if we do not stay together. So the idea of global citizenship is that what I tried to explain during these few remarks, that climate change forces us worldwide, everywhere, to work together, to join, to form a team spirit, and to fight climate change. And I am quite optimistic about the possible results of what climate change can produce in terms of international solidarity. I'll give you just one example. I read recently a very interesting article saying that today Jordan and Israel plan to work together for, you know what, saving the Dead Sea. it happens that the Dead Sea, is dying, it's evaporating, it's drying up, and both countries badly need the Dead Sea. So they are able to work together, Israel and Jordan, to forget or to overcome their political differences in a region which is full of tensions, political tensions so everywhere. And that's an example which shows that when things come to environment and to the necessity to, well, to ensure our future, to save our environment and the climate of the earth, we can overcome the difficulties. It's just a matter of political will, of course, but also the pressure of the climate change is so strong that you are obliged to forget your political differences. So I am quite optimistic. Concerning the passport, it's a dream. It's a dream, of course. When I say global citizen passport, it's not for tomorrow, maybe not the day after tomorrow, but one day there will be something like this. It's too early to tell about this. So the second question, concerning the pace, of course, it's too slow. But we have to consider the what was achieved up to today. If you keep in mind that historically the very first meeting which was convened about the climate change was in 1979. It was a meeting which gathered only scientists. There was nobody else interested by climate change at that time. There was no politician, there was no private sector representative, there was only scientists. So they were working together with datas, and from that year they started to communicate and to warn the world opinion about the dangers of climate change. The result was that in 1988, less than 10 years later, the International Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, was set up with the support of the world opinion and the governments, and started to work. And within few years, in 1992, viewing the scientific data released by the IPCC, the Rio Summit in 1992 produced tremendous results. It was the very first summit on climate which was organized, and the very first convention. You may remember that in Rio there was the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed, and since then, every day after Rio, we organized yearly a meeting, which is the meeting of the parties contractantes, contracting parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which are called COP in French, COP, Conférence des Parties, Conference of the Parties, every year. So COP21 was the one organized in Paris, which gave rise to the Paris Agreement. The COP24 will take place next month in December in Poland. So every year now, the scientists, but the leaders, the private sector representatives, they meet. So if you check what was accomplished during these last, let's say, less than 40 years, it's tremendous. Because at the beginning, nobody has any interest in climate change. So I'm quite optimistic, because now we witness something which can be assimilated to an acceleration. Of course, we can do better, we can do faster, but the pace accelerates. And the best proof is that now, as you reminded, we are working on a possible, I cross fingers, possible global pact for environment. Paris Agreement has been now ratified by 180 countries. It covers 90% of the total greenhouse gases emissions. So we can consider that Paris Agreement is now a step which now much behind us, and we have to work for the future. So I'm quite optimistic about the new rhythm of the cooperation, worldwide, global cooperation in terms of fight against climate change. And last but not least, I would like to stress that there are, before Paris Agreement, at least two major achievements which are not comparable to Paris Agreement, but which can be considered as achievements in terms of fight against climate change and serious achievements. You may remember that in 1980s there was the gases which were called CFC, chlorofluorocarbons, which the scientists, once again, the role of scientists is very important, showed that it was destroying the layer of ozone in the atmosphere, in the high atmosphere. And with the terrible consequences for human skin and so on, because of the proliferation of UV rays. And the scientists mobilized, then political decision makers mobilized, and in 1995 there was a convention which was signed in Vienna, la Convention pour la protection de la couche d'ozone, Convention for the protection of the ozone layer, and 2 years later the Protocol of Montreal. Protocol of Montreal was a major achievement by which the chlorofluorocarbons gases, the CFCs, were totally banned, where you don't find it anymore in the industry. So that means within few years, humankind managed to solve a problem which was global, because the destruction of ozone layer was terrible consequences for everybody, and we got it. And second achievement, I would not to speak too long, is the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol, it's really something. It was signed in 1997, and now it has been ratified by 192 countries. So now the Kyoto Protocol is behind us, because now we are working on more texts, and Paris Agreement was signed after this, but it's another major achievement. So I am optimistic when you see these few examples which show that when things come to mankind's survival, it's a matter of survival, solidarity can work beyond political differences and other differences. So, well, I'm a diplomat, I'm optimistic, so I cannot do that.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that.
Can't say
Let's take a couple more questions, all the way running close to the end.
Sorry.
No, that's fine, that's fine. Please remember to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Dave Cowlesser from the Caribbean Association of Industry and Commerce. Ambassador, and in your roles, I'm actually trying to gauge what is the reaction of the private sector in France, or in your capacities that you have, to the concept of climate change. And the reason I'm asking that is that we had started at the CAIC to work on the issue in its broadest sense by narrowing it down to business continuity. We felt that if we took the issue of business life post a disaster, natural disaster primarily, we would get more traction. And it actually came and took root post Maria in Dominica, where we held one of the first business continuity workshops, paid for by some of the participants and partly funded by the government. So I'm just trying to see whether the French private sector in itself has taken some hold outside of any corporate social responsibility with regard to the issue of climate change, especially given the commitments of the French president. Yep. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Let's take a couple more questions, and then we will end the round of questions and allow the ambassador to respond. Yes?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Annabella Thorne. I guess a representative of Eurocham. My interest is with regards to, well, we're mostly, I hear in the Caribbean that we're focusing on energy and technology directions. Maybe if persons from the room can maybe give an understanding maybe of what other kind of initiatives, technologies, mechanisms can relate to other than energy or tourism and things like that. Can be for trade, manufacturing, retail production, things like that. I'm actually kind of want to find out a little more about.
Okay, just one more question. Yes?
Thank you very much. I am from the United Nations Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Commendations to the Institute of International Relations and, of course, the excellent presentation by Ambassador Lavroff. We have had an excellent overview of what is going on internationally with regard to climate change. But now I am very concerned, in fact, we are very concerned about what has been happening in the region and within the last decade, or even more so in the last 5 years, where we have had many of our islands really, really devastated by hurricanes and natural disasters. And in more recent weeks, we have been experiencing it here in Trinidad and Tobago with our recent flooding without a storm or hurricane. And we have earthquakes almost daily right now. If anyone can share information as to what plans are there in place to really address climate change, climate action in a real sense in our region. I don't know if anyone can speak to that at this point. I think that's what we would really like to hear.
Okay.
But I do appreciate the excellent overview that was presented.
Okay, thank you. So we have 3 sets of questions from Dave Colosa regarding the reaction of the private sector in France, then Annabel Thorne on energy technology and other initiatives that may be afoot in the region with regard to climate change, and finally UN Association on the more local applications in terms of responses to climate change. So Ambassador, where you can.
Well, I will 3 questions in totally different directions. So I'll try to refocus myself in the center. Okay. The third question. The science of climate change is just at its beginning. And the scientists themselves, especially including the IPCC, recognize that they learn every year something new. You know that the IPCC produces a report more or less every 5 years, and each report puts an added value to the other ones. So that means that the science of climate change is still taking off, and we are far from knowing everything about what is going on in the nature and in the atmosphere, and especially on land as well. You mentioned the earthquakes. As far as I know, there are not yet any correlation between earthquakes and climate change, but maybe one day it will be exposed, released. So you are concerned about the Caribbean's future, and many people in the world do share your concern, because we are here in a very vulnerable region, which is submitted to sea level rise and so on. And you are right when you say we focus too much on the energy. We have also to work for in other sectors. I will give you an example where an institution, a regional institution, organization, works actively for the protection of the environment of the Caribbean, which is the Association of Caribbean States. The ACS has now a very interesting program. There are 2 programs. First one, which is already solidly financed, which is called the Sandy Shoreline Program. Sandy Shoreline aims at fighting against the coastal erosion in the Caribbean, which is a problem everywhere in this region. The second program is Coral Reef, but it's not yet financed. But there is a consensus within the ACS and within the supporters of the ACS to do something in this very sensitive area. So that means there are at least 2 examples which show that the Caribbean region is also in the center of the focus of the attention for other issues than energy. I think it was the sense of your question, yeah? We put too much stress on energy. Of course, energy is the basis of everything. Without energy, you cannot move anywhere. But of course, we do not lose out of sight the other aspects, especially coastal erosion, which is a terrible problem in certain parts of the Caribbean. So I don't know whether I said to the third question.
So,
There are two more other questions. Okay, the
private sector in France.
Eurocham. Eurocham, what was your question? Can you remind me quickly? Sorry, it was okay, it was your question. Okay.
But what other areas that are
Yeah.
kind of coming up as,
Yeah.
because you had mentioned with Jamaica that they are
Yeah. Yeah.
having, so
Yeah.
once I hear, okay, is
Yeah.
there any
Yeah.
direction
Yeah.
in manufacturing, is there any kind of other areas which can also contribute to
Yeah.
less pollution to
Yeah.
actually mitigating?
Well, I bounce on what you said about the climate smart zone project, which is a wonderful project. It's just the beginning. It was officially launched in Kingston last August with a very strong effort in terms of communication. Communication, why? Because the project has to mobilize investors, private sector. Some development banks have already announced that they will take part in the project. There are two ambassadors of the Climate Smart Zone projects who are Usain Bolt, and Sean Paul, also the singer Sean Paul. So there are some banks already like ADB who are on board. ADB announced, I don't know how far it will go, but I saw the figure, I was quite impressed, that they will try to go up to $1 billion to put in the project. 26 countries are now involved. It's very good because at the beginning, last year in Paris, when the idea was launched, when the commitment was taken, there were only 11 countries. Up to now, we have 26 countries on board. I did not see in the list Trinidad, not yet, but I think we can count on the fact that sooner or later we'll have a 27th member. Trinidad, I think it would be a good thing for everybody, including for your country. So I think the Climate Smart Zone project, Caribbean Climate Smart Zone project is a very interesting and I think deserves to be supported. And of course it will cover all areas. And the Prime Minister of Jamaica, even when he announced the project, it was in Kingston, so it was the Prime Minister of Jamaica, so he took the floor. He said it will have a tremendous impact in terms of job creations also for the youngsters in the region. So I think we have to wait and see and to see this project taking off, not slowly, but maybe quickly in the months and years to come. Well, I think there was one more question, which was the first one. The private sector in France, of course, is submitted to a very strong pressure of the president. Of course, the president cannot order the private sector in France to do investments or to put money on the table overnight. But he's very convincing. And the evidence shows that in France, the private sector is now mobilizing for the climate change. I should have given examples of French companies because I know I quoted Michael Bloomberg, I quoted BlackRock as people and institutions putting money on the table for the la finance du climat, as we say in French, climate finance. But I can assure you that there are more and more efforts now within the private sector in France to, especially some banks, to find available money to support projects in the environment and climate change projects. By saying so, I'm trying to find an example. Yeah, yeah.
For overall reaction.
Yeah, yeah. What I can say is that in France, we have an exception compared with many other countries in the world. Our nuclear sector, 75% of the electricity in France is generated by nuclear plants. So EDF, which is the manager, the Électricité de France, the equivalent of TNT and Tech in France, much bigger, is deeply involved in this reconversion of the nuclear sector in France into renewable energies. In France, we have to reach by 2030, 32% of our electricity generated by renewable energies, which is a very ambitious project, but goal, but it is the European Union target, which is applying erga omnes to all European Union member states. And this is quite a difficult equation to transform, to turn part of this sector, nuclear sector, into clean and renewable energies. So EDF has a lot of money to ensure this conversion. I'm not sure I answered to your question. I just wanted to show you that the situation is very complex in France, which does not exclude that some companies, especially some banks, are ready to finance climate change projects. The Agence Française de Développement, which is our agency for the development, is now working actively on projects, on financing, on looking for projects to be financed in the area of climate change. The president a few weeks ago announced that France wishes to increase the development aid, public development aid, to put 1 more billion next year in order to reach the goal of 0.55% of the GDP, French GDP, by 2022, devoted to the development, public development aid. Today it's quite low, it's 0.38, it's quite far, even 0.55 is quite far from the target, which is usually recognized as a reasonable of 0.7. We are far from this, but it's a tremendous effort which will be done, and especially through the agency, AFD, Agence Française de Développement, with one priority, and the president insists on this, and the agency starts already to communicate widely on this aspect, that the projects which will be financed in priority will be the projects linked directly to climate change, the fight against climate change. So I try to refocus myself on the initial part of your question, which was concerning, as far as I remember, the Caribbean. I think sooner or later AFD will come here and start to think about possible financing of projects in the whole region. There is a new office of the AFD which was opened a few weeks ago or a month ago in Martinique. It's based in Martinique, in French territory, but the representative and the office, they will travel in the whole region. And they already announced me that they want to come to Trinidad. So I said, you are welcome, of course. You can even come tomorrow, because we have so few visitors up to now. So we can expect that the French Agency for Development Aid will be more and more involved in financing climate change projects in the region in the months and years to come. So this is more or less what I can tell to you without betraying state secrets.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, based on our schedule, although we have 2:15 as the vote of thanks, that would require 45 minutes of vote of thanks, because we finish at 3. So if you don't want to hear 45 minutes of vote of thanks, which I believe is the case, we can continue with another round of questions and comments. Maybe some people may want to respond to some of the comments made already as well, and we will delay the vote of thanks for another 20 minutes. Is that okay? Yes? Okay, so more questions or comments? In response, just briefly, I'm not going to be talking much, but in response to what we've been doing in the Caribbean has been working quite a bit at CARICOM level. In fact, we've been praised internationally for CRIFT, our own regional disaster fund. It's one of the first in the world that's particularly geared towards quick financing after a climate event or an important disaster. That has a lot of problems, but it is an excellent initiative and one of many in the region. But I'm sure the Institute has many activities. We will invite you to them, and and many of them speak to some of these issues as well. But I don't know if anybody else in the audience would like to speak to that or would like to ask another question of the ambassador or just make a general comment.
If I can comment a bit further on that, I think funding is one aspect of it.
Just a second, because they're filming.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up to your comment, the funding is one aspect of it, but I think as citizens, we too have a responsibility, and it would be great to hear of the advocacy in terms of the citizenry taking more proactive action to address many of the issues we face. We tend to be more reactive, and I would like to see how we are going proactively into dealing with the climate change issues that we face.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we have another question here. Or comment?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So a couple of things.
Sorry, we
sorry,
know you, but
sorry, my name's Karen Niles, intellectual.
Yes.
Hi, good day. So this is Ambassador Lavroff. So my name is Karen Niles. I'm a lecturer here for International Political Economy of Climate Change. So just a couple of things. One is in terms of other things and other angles currently being explored. There's currently a lot of work being done right now on the blue economy and green economy, particularly very, very aggressively by the Caribbean Development Bank in particular, to explore angles that are complementary to climate resilience and really asking deep questions of how we use energy in the region, how we produce food in the region, and what are the new agricultural technologies that we can use to really boost our own resilience, and not just in terms of withstanding incidences of floods and inundation like we've had in Trinidad and Tobago, but also just reducing our food import bill, which is another benefit. Another approach being taken in this region as well is looking more specifically at circular. By the way, one of the two specific areas for Caribbean consideration would be one, the use of sargassum seaweed in the Caribbean, and technological approaches to modernizing that in the Caribbean. The second one would be oil and gas and what we do offshore. So we have fisheries and issues related to fisheries offshore. But then we also have oil and gas, which of course has been given a new life in Guyana. And so what does a blue economy actually mean for offshore oil and gas production, and what technologies do we need to put in place to ensure that it's done in a more sustainable way, that they learn from lessons that or they learn from other mistakes that we probably have made and other countries in the region have made as well. The other thing about that as well is you probably also want to find out more about what's happening in the circular economy for the Caribbean, which is where I think the Caribbean Climate Innovation Council, the CCIC, is doing a lot of work in terms of getting innovators, Caribbean entrepreneurs and innovators, to actually produce more technologies, not just the green economy and blue economy, but in the circular economy as well. Circular economy, for some people, is a bit more provocative. When I went to a conference last year, the speaker actually said that carbon is not the problem. Carbon is just an element in the periodic table. But what he actually meant was carbon in the atmosphere is a problem. So what do we need to do with that carbon? Where can we reuse that? And a lot of work is being done in terms of technological uses of carbon sequestration, carbon reuse. So there's a lot of work being done there as well. And I know that representatives from the Environmental Policy and Planning Division are here, so they can probably answer questions related to our climate change policy, specifically for Trinidad and Tobago, which is currently being reworked and updated as we speak. I think that'll stop there.
Thanks, Karen. Questions, comments, reactions to that, or to anything else that we've commented on thus far? Dave?
Thanks. And Dave Cowlesser, CAIC again. Thanks, Karen. So when those questions, which are good, are asked and answered, how does it integrate into practical life or change or innovation, especially within the business sector? Is there a mechanism that treats with that? Because Again, it's quite good work, necessary work. But as someone said at Climate Week in the fringes of UN General Assembly in New York, this is the first generation that has been exposed to the effects of climate change, and is probably the last generation that can do something about it. So at the same time, we have a double whammy. So what you're doing is important, but by the time it goes up all over, spreads, comes back down, it's another 20 years or 25. So what's being done? Thanks.
Just before we get the reaction from Karen, anybody else has anything that may take this in another direction that would like to say something before we move on?
That's right.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. Anthony Gonzalez. I remember some time ago, I think, Michelle, you were there, we were looking at the financing aspect, and in particular the cost of mitigation and adaptation and so on. And we found that the available funding fell way below what these small islands required. My concern here is really that given what I consider to be more or less a failure of the Green Fund, the Climate Fund, seeing that what has happened with the United States and so on, my fear is that financing needs have fallen even, well, our expectations would have dropped way below what is required. I don't know if anyone here has some idea as to really where we are on that level, because to my mind that is the bottom line. In terms of, I think we were saying at one point in time that we may only have to try to focus on mitigation rather than adaptation, because the cost of adaptation was way beyond us. And just hope that the sea level doesn't go beyond 1.5, 1.5, which is what we fought for in the Paris Agreement. But I now see most people seem to think that that is not possible. It's going to go way beyond 2 degrees, right?
Okay, just we have Professor Byron, yes?
No, I just wanted to throw into the mix, since we're asking questions, I don't know whether the ambassador or anybody else wants to address this, but one of the areas of focus in the Caribbean in terms of renewable technologies has been geothermal energy. Now, I think the island in the Caribbean that is most advanced is Guadeloupe in that respect. But Dominica was moving along quite well until Hurricane Maria. And Dominica was reported to be pretty soon in a position to supply domestic electricity needs and possibly export. And there are a number of other countries in the Eastern Caribbean, St. Vincent, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, that are all very, very interested in developing their geothermal sources of energy. And I'm just wondering where we are in that sense in the Caribbean at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador, you would like to say something?
Yeah, briefly. I fully agree with Karen Niles, that innovation, this is just to summarize in one word the sense of your intervention. Innovation is now essential. We need to mobilize fundings, that's true, but we need also to mobilize brains and talents to find new technologies, new ways, new methods. And you mentioned this, I don't remember whether he's from St. Lucia or some other Caribbean country, this young guy who now, who found a way to transform, to turn seaweeds, the sargasso seaweeds, into fertilizer. I did not follow 100% the issue, but as far as I remember, he's not far from getting his innovation to be breveté, comment on dit, to meet the standards. Yeah, patent. Yeah. So innovation is essential. The scientists work on the datas, which are more and more numerous, and to show us what are the trends in our environment and the climate. But now also the engineers and the young talents, they have their word to say in terms of innovating. And for innovating, of course, they need to be helped, to be supported and funded, of course. Yeah, that's right. So, and for Madame, I have just a quick reaction about what you said about the individual behavior. This is very important, of course. It's the fight against climate change. It's at each level, not only a stratospheric level of international organizations like UN or governments, but also private sector, companies, and individuals. But the scientists of the IPCC found a very interesting result in their calculations. Don't ask me how they reached this result, according to which the impact of the individual behavior on the climate is only 14% of the total. The 86 remaining percent are the result in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The 86 remaining percent are results of collective choices, either national policies or practices of companies, liberal regulations. So collective action is much more impactful on the climate than individual behavior. I'm sorry to say so, but that does not prevent us as individuals, as citizens of the earth, of course, global citizens, to behave in a proper way to respect the environment. Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. So we have some very pressing things already on the floor. And the question of innovation, blue-green economy, we had Dave arguing for something specific because of the urgency of the situation. We have Dr. Gonzalez speaking about the question of climate financing, which is quite an issue. We have some former negotiators in the room who knows how much of an issue that has been, quite sidestepped to the last Paris Agreement because of the inability to agree on liability for climate change, but that's an elephant in the room for many, I think. And then the question of geothermal as a new renewable energy source. Anybody has comments on those or would like to add anything? Yes, we have two responses to comments.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Bullock. I'm a physics candidate in geothermal energy research and geophysics. So in response to Professor Byron, I'm actually from St. Vincent, by the way. So we are in the stage right now where they are constructing the drill pads. They have received funding. They, being St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Dominica, received funding last year, I think was from the European Union. And they would have received funding as well from the United Arab Emirates. Dominica received the green light for geothermal development, and they would have already drilled wells, exploration wells, and I think they're now in the stage of drilling the production wells. So that project is a go. With regards to St. Vincent, of course, no drilling has been done as yet, but it's a future prospect. I think right now they're still in the negotiation phase with Emira. St. Lucia still has a lot of work to be done. I think they're still in the exploration stage. And Grenada, I think, are still in the negotiation phase as well. Now, I would like to add a comment with regards to climate change. Now, we in the Caribbean, we are facing a lot of the effects of it, and we are very small islands, of course, in comparison to the rest of the world. However, we are seeing now more than ever, we are being affected a lot. Like we saw last week with regard to Trinidad. In the tropics, we are prone to hurricanes every year. And we need to look at climate change not just at a regional level, but at an international level. We have to look at this holistically. And even though we are trying to implement a lot of renewable energy strategies, we have a lot of industries, companies that are gearing towards more renewable energy technologies, as we see. We have to realize that the issue of oil, every day billions of barrels of oil are being drilled, being extracted, and fossil fuels are being burned every day. If this is continuing, how much with these new innovations with regard to renewable energy, how are we tipping the balance? And how then can we, as citizens and these companies, how can we give incentive or at least try to, I don't know, ask these people to, I don't know, could we say we're gonna stop drilling for oil? You understand where I'm coming from? How are we tipping the balance here? Yeah, because if oil is still being drilled for, if we are a world that we rely on electricity, everything, we need electricity, we need energy to function. But if hydrocarbons are being burned every day, so much carbon emissions are happening, and there is only so much that we can do for carbon sequestration. Where are we going?
Good points. 2 more questions.
Well, that's a tough one, eh? I think actually just to pick up on that last point. So I'm Carla Hogan-Ruffels. I'm the High Commissioner for Canada. First of all, Serge, fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Really, I would never have agreed to make that presentation. Very, very well done. Just to pick up on that last point, I think it's something that Canada struggles with very much, right? And so the way that our Minister of Environment and Climate Change talks about it is we're in a transition, and that transition isn't going to happen in 2 years or 5 years, or it's a long transition, but we are transitioning. And so, but as the Canadian economy depends very much on its non-renewable resources, and it will continue to do so for a long time. But there's a shift, and that's the important piece, and that you can do both. You can build a policy framework and regulations that aim toward getting to the targets, while at the same time recognizing that there's an economic imperative that has to continue to be managed over a long period of time as a transition continues. And that transition is not just national, it's very much global, right? And that's where Trinidad and Tobago sits as well, very much. But it's being brave enough to really start to recognize that that transition is happening, needs to start to be integrated, and movement towards that, and being honest enough to say, this is what's going on, right? Like we're, like, you know. Just a couple of other points. Just on the point, I just happened to come out of a conversation this morning. We brought in a Canadian today, over this week, who is actually an expert in innovation. And he's going to be he's giving the keynote address tomorrow night at the TT Chamber Champions in Business Gala Award night. And he's talking exactly about some of the questions that were asked here around innovation. And so this morning he met with a group at the TT Chamber, a small group of Trinbagonian business people in the food and beverage industry. And so some people were asking about just real practical things, you know, what are some practical things that are going on? And so on the Canadian side, some of the Canadian models are something called innovation clusters, where the private sector, academia, civil society organizations, government can get together and are getting together, and there are 6 actual innovation clusters that are being supported by the Government of Canada in aerospace. Oceans is another one, agri-food, and so on. Now, what they do is they really look for where there is a challenge that's shared, like an innovation challenge that's shared across stakeholders, and where those stakeholders may individually be investing and try to deal with this problem. the one that at the table this morning with the food and beverage industries was labeling, and how every market needs a different label, and how do you deal with that? And every single food and beverage company is dealing with it themselves. Well, how do you get together, and all of you, rather than spending your own dollar, put your resources together and deal with that problem together? You end up spending 20 cents instead, and you kind of, so that's one idea. The other is around waste reduction and efficiencies in production, and that the idea is there. How do you use less water or in your production, or how do you reuse your waste water? How can you, or other types of waste? One example was the husk that comes off of rice. The rice is being used in the production. What do you do with mountains and mountains of husk? Well, one of the simple innovations in one of the countries, I can't remember, the Canadian that Peter was talking about, just turn it into pressed fuel pellets, essentially. So there was a gentleman around the table from Fresh, John Haddad, I think, and he was giving a great example of recycling used cooking oil. This canola oil that comes in from Canada, that gets used in tremendous quantities for fried chicken. And then what, right? And it was going into drains, and it was going into the landfills, etc. Well, they have, I think it was one innovator, one entrepreneur, collects that used oil, actually cleans it somehow, like processes it, and now sells it as biofuel to Spain. So, it's these kinds of innovations. But one of the interesting things challenges that came up around the table was that in the Canadian context, our business people are really quite collaborative. As long as you're not jeopardizing trade secrets, hey, why not? Let's work together on a common problem. And everyone around the room this morning in the Trinbagonian context were like, no, we don't really do that much. And part of the discussion was, well, it's a tiny market, right? I mean, it's 1.3 in Trinidad and Tobago. It's 9 million in the whole region. I mean, how do you keep your competitive edge, right? So those were just some things that came up today that I was thinking you might be interested in hearing. And the bottle bill, that's the other thing they were talking about. Hey, let's just move forward on the bottle bill. Let's not wait for the government. Let's just do it. Let's do it. And, let's encourage them to go ahead. And then finally, I'm sorry to go on so long, but finally, I just had to pick up on the blue economy. I'm so glad you did. And this links back into the question on funding. So Canada is co-hosting the Sustainable Blue Economy Conference, which is taking place in Nairobi. It's really the first of its kind. It's taking place later in November. I think it's the 25th to 28th in Nairobi. And so our ambassador for the blue economy was here about 3-4 weeks ago. And we had some great conversations with stakeholders in Trinidad and Tobago. And I just finally got word that Canada, amongst others, including the French, are funding, putting funding forward for delegations from small island and developing. I don't want to always put developing in, because Trinidad is not really Trinidad and Tobago. It's not really a developing country, but it certainly is an island. It's a small island. So Trinidad and Tobago and 96 other countries are getting funding for up to 8-person delegations. Now, that gets back to what's happening locally, right? And I think the point made a few times by our friend over here, and that is, how fundamental what Serge says about multilateral agreements and dialogue and commitment, how important that is. But it's got to translate into action on the ground. And that's where, boy, oh boy, do I ever want a really strong Trinbagonian delegation to go to Nairobi. But more than that, it's what do we do together afterwards? What do we do in the region and in Trinidad and Tobago after that to see some of the issues around the blue economy being addressed? Sorry to go on so long.
No,
It's exciting.
thank you very much, Ambassador. High Commissioner, those things are very interesting. We actually have two more comments, and we have to finish in 5 minutes. We have somebody at the back of the room and this lady as well. So please keep your comments brief so we can have the comments and then a response from the ambassador.
Good afternoon. I'm Lily Edgerton, the Costa Rican ambassador. And just to pick up on the lady's inquiry on what should we do on fuel explorations and that sort of things, I just wanted to put on the table the Costa Rican experience. Because our civil society is so demanding, right now there is a discussion in our National Assembly, like our parliament, to actually ban by constitution any petroleum explorations in our territory. And you know, consider that it is also a Caribbean country and it is a small country. So we have something in common. And that, of course, is possible because over 40 years, we went from maybe 40-something years, we went from 3 products that we exported to 3,000, almost 4,000. And that is a long-term planning. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Very interesting indeed. Okay, we have another comment from the lady at the back of the room.
Thanks, Lisa. Good day, everyone. My name's Tony Blackman. I'm a doctoral student here in sustainable transportation and sustainability, in fact. One of the things I want to talk about that we don't talk enough about here is mitigation. I'm going to come back to that because a lot of the more developed countries, like even 4 years ago already in Switzerland, they decided that there was too much garbage and that individual households needed to restrict how much garbage they actually used. And so, of course, that caused a whole big hoopla. A lot of people thought, well, what the heck, we'll just pay for it and we won't, you know, reduce. But in fact, the population really took charge. The law was implemented, they followed the law, and they reduced their garbage by, I think, something like 40% already, right? And also how they get rid of waste, what they get rid of, and how they should recycle. Now, one of the things that we don't do in the Caribbean, and we are really at risk because we're such small islands, right? Compared to a city like New York, if Sandy had hit Trinidad, we would be no more, right? What we tend to do is wait for somebody else to do it for us. And Trinidad and Tobago happens to be at the level in terms of economy that we don't really get a lot of funding from other organizations anymore. We used to in the 80s, and we didn't really use that money well to implement laws and programs to mitigate what's happening in this country. Now, we are talking about big funding, but just look at one of the reasons, one of the big reasons we have issues with flooding. It's a really on-the-ground kind of issue. And I just want to say that unless we first look inward, we're talking about funding, but these are some things that are really basic things, human, you know, common sense, and just using the resources that we have wisely. Water, for example, how we use water, and so many other of our resources. Before asking abroad, because people abroad are looking at us saying, well, what have you done? And they are now seeing that they have to spend money on these issues, and so I really hope, I mean, that's my fervent wish, you know, that we would stop begging in a way and come up with solutions and actually implement them. And maybe if we do that, then other people will help us to mitigate better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting comments. I think each of them deserves at least an hour of discussion. I certainly have about an hour of comments on each one, but I'll save you my comments. I'd like to thank you all. It's not the official vote of thanks, but seriously, it's been, I think, a very engaging, lively set of discussions and a lot to think about. You know, we have many issues that have come to the fore, from what can be done on the ground to what's done at the global level, to financing, to the link between disasters and garbage, and the climate change disasters and garbage use. I mean, they're all linked to what the High Commissioner spoke about of transitioning and the initiatives that are on the ground. So I think perhaps we need another sort of engagement on climate change before we end this chapter. But that's it for me. I'd like to pass the floor to the ambassador for any final comments on this one before we go to the vote of thanks.
Yeah, the advantage to speak last is that everything has been said, or nearly everything. So I will be short. I just want to bounce on what has been said by Carla. It's true, we are in a transitional period now. And to refer to your question or to your comment, oil industry will not disappear overnight. But my conviction, and many people also see the same in the same way, the situation in the same way, is that oil is declining. Because more and more people in the private sector are now distancing themselves from oil industry. They are more investing in the clean energies, in renewable energies, or even stop simply to finance projects linked to oil industry. I'll give you an example. I've just one example in mind, but I can multiply the examples. World Bank, during the One Planet Summit in Paris, announced that they will stop financing any project which is linked to the fossil fuel energies. So if an institution like the World Bank announces and mediatizes such a decision, that means there is something is happening, maybe behind the scene is not yet obvious, in terms of declining of the step-by-step of the oil industry sector. So I'm optimistic, but of course we need time, and it will take some years before reaching the moment when the clean energy and the renewable energy will reach, how to say, with the crossing point with two curves. You know, cleaning energy, especially solar energy. Solar energy is it's a wonderful source of energy, which is getting cheaper and cheaper. Okay, thank you for coming. And I would like to pay tribute to Costa Rica also, because you give up with your armed forces 70 years ago, and to devote the remaining means to the protection of your environment and social policies. So that's, and you are doing the same with oil. Maybe about to do the same in oil. So it deserves to be mentioned. Okay. Yeah. So I'm quite optimistic about not the future of the oil industry, of the non-future, not future of the oil industry. And I think it will take more years before we see clearly what is going on, definitely. We are just at the beginning of a new period.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. It's after 3, and we're about to close, so I'd like to invite my colleague, Karen Niles, Dr. Karen Niles, to come and give the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh wow, I guess you guys are tired. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so, I mean, we are running a few minutes late, so let me thank Ambassador Lavroff and the staff of the embassy for what was indeed a very enlightening presentation. I think he deserves another round of applause for his contribution here today. I want to say thank you as well to the head of this institute, the Institute of International Relations, Professor Jessica Byron, and thank you very much, Dr. Scobie, for being such a fantastic chair. I also want to say real thanks to staff of the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean, specifically Ms. Zara Weeks-Reiser, for a lot of the logistical support to actually get this event up and running and off the ground. To the technical staff of this institute, Mr. Gerard Modest and John Maloney, thank you so much for providing us with such trustworthy support. To the Secretariat staff, who, as always, reliably support us to actually pull these events off. And I also want to say thanks to the representatives of government that actually showed up today. As a Trinidadian, I can tell you I'm very, very proud. So specific mention, I know Permanent Secretary Sweet has already left, but those representatives of the Ministry of Planning and Development, Marion, I see you, to representatives of the Environmental Policy and Planning Division, I see you all and recognize you. That's the division of our government that's responsible for climate change policy. So thank you very much for coming. It means a lot to the Institute to have you here. And thank you very much, members of the audience, members of the Diplomatic Corps, for coming to this event. And I want to encourage us all to please keep the conversation going. Just last week I was in Greenvale, that was completely flooded out. This is a very real topic for us. We live in these islands. We are very susceptible to the impacts of climate change. For our own sake, if not for the sake of the planet, let us keep the conversation going about how we can translate this discussion to action. Thank you very much and have a pleasant afternoon.